I should have known better. 50 years as a park ranger taught me one thing. When locals warn you about a place, you listen. But I've never been one to believe in ghost stories. Superstitions were just another thing that came with small-town life, like potluck dinners and neighbors who knew your business. After my wife passed, I sold the house. It felt too empty, too loud with her absence. I hit the road in our old RV, looking for places where the silence wasn't so heavy. That's how I ended up at Dead Man's Hollow in southeastern Ohio, a place with a reputation darker than the coal it used to mine. The name alone should have given me pause. The gas station was the last bit of civilization before the road turned to dirt and the woods swallowed the world. The young guy at the counter was a jittery type, all elbows and sideways glances. "You heading up to the hollow?" he asked as he handed me my change. "Yeah," I replied, tossing the bag of jerky onto the passenger seat. His eyes darted to the parking lot. "You shouldn't go there." "Oh yeah? Why's that?" "People go missing out there, or come back different." He leaned in closer. "My granddad said the land's cursed. Miners died bad back in the day, and folks started seeing things." I gave him a polite nod and left. I didn't need a campfire story, I needed peace. The road into Dead Man's Hollow twisted like a snake, the trees crowding so close they nearly blocked out the sun. By the time I reached the old campsite, shadows stretched long across the clearing. It was just me and my RV, alone in the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Perfect. I set up camp and brewed a pot of coffee, the rich smell cutting through the cool evening air. The first night passed quietly, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The second night was when the tapping started. It woke me around midnight. A faint, rhythmic sound on the RV window. Tap, tap, tap. I rolled over, groggy and annoyed. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the glass, but when I pulled back the curtain, nothing was there. Just darkness and the skeletal outlines of trees. The tapping stopped as soon as I looked. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. A narrow trail led from the campsite into the heart of the hollow, winding through dense underbrush. It wasn't long before I came across the ruins of the old mining operation. A rusted winch, crumbling stone walls, and the gaping black maw of a collapsed mine entrance. That's when I saw it, a mining helmet half buried in the dirt. Its lamp was shattered, and the leather strap had rotted away, but something about it called to me. I brushed off the dirt and slipped it into my pack. As I turned to leave, I felt it. A prickling sensation, like static electricity crawling over my skin. The air grew heavy, the kind of pressure that signals an oncoming storm. I glanced back at the mine, half expecting to see someone watching me. Nothing. By the time I returned to camp, the feeling had passed, but unease lingered like the smell of smoke after a fire. That night, the tapping came back. Louder this time. I sat up, every nerve on edge. The sound was steady, deliberate. Not the random scratching of a branch or the scampering of an animal. Tap, tap, tap. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty woods. The night was unnaturally still. No wind, no crickets, not even the hoot of an owl. Then I saw them. Footprints. They circled the RV, leading toward the ruins. My stomach tightened as I crouched to examine them. They were boot prints, wide and deep, as if made by someone dragging heavy equipment. But they weren't fresh. The edges were crumbling, as though the soil had been disturbed long ago. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I told myself I was imagining things. Grief can play tricks on the mind, and I was no stranger to the loneliness that comes with isolation. But when I saw the mining helmet sitting on the table, perfectly cleaned and polished. I knew something was wrong. I hadn't touched it since I found it. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Static hissed from the speakers, rising and falling like waves. Then, faintly, I heard it. Voices. "Mister, help, us." The words were garbled, buried beneath the static but unmistakable. My breath caught as the static turned to a low, guttural moan. The radio clicked off on its own, leaving me in deafening silence. I should have left right then, packed up, hit the road, and never looked back. But something in me, a mix of pride and curiosity, drove me back to the ruins that night. The hollow was darker than before, the trees pressing in like watchful sentinels. I reached the mine entrance, my flashlight barely piercing the blackness. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the void. The air shifted, carrying with it a metallic tang. A faint light flickered deep within the collapsed mine, a lantern. It bobbed slowly, as if carried by an unseen hand. I stepped closer, and the ground seemed to hum beneath my feet. The light grew brighter, and then they appeared. Shadowy figures, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness around them. They moved silently, their lanterns casting an unnatural, cold light. One turned toward me, its hollow gaze locking with mine. My legs froze, rooted to the spot as the shadows closed in. Then she appeared, the woman in black. Her form was sharper than the others, her face pale and expressionless beneath the hood of her tattered cloak. She raised a hand and the shadows stopped. Her eyes bored into me, unblinking and full of malice. "You disturbed their rest," she whispered. Her voice was like the rustle of dead leaves, brittle and ancient. Before I could respond, the ground beneath me gave way. I woke hours later, sprawled in the clearing near my RV. My flashlight was gone, and my clothes were smeared with dirt. The mining helmet sat beside me, shattered into pieces. Scrawled in ash on the ground was a single word: "Leave." The ghosts were gone, but their warning was clear. I didn't waste time packing. As I drove out of the hollow, the shadows seemed to follow, their lanterns flickering in the rearview mirror until I reached the main road. Back in town, I stopped at a diner for coffee, my hands still shaking. The waitress gave me a sympathetic smile. "You okay, hun?" she asked. "Dead Man's Hollow," I said, my voice hoarse. Her face fell. "You shouldn't have gone there." "Yeah," I muttered. "I figured that out." Weeks later, as I prepared for another trip, I found the mining helmet on my passenger seat. It was whole again, its lamp gleaming like new. No matter how far I drive, I don't think I'll ever really leave Dead Man's Hollow. The road into Zaleski State Forest twisted like a black ribbon through the trees, the late autumn chill seeping through the cracks of my old RV. It was exactly the kind of place I loved. Remote, rugged, and steeped in just enough folklore to make things interesting. I'd read about Zaleski on a cryptid forum, where whispers of a forest demon had been growing louder in recent years. Disappearances, claw marks, voices mimicking loved ones. Most people dismissed it as tall tales. I wasn't most people. My name's Marcus, and for the last decade chasing cryptids has been my passion. Not that I believed in all of them. Bigfoot, the Jersey Devil, Mothman. Maybe they were real, maybe not. But there's something intoxicating about the hunt, the chance to glimpse the unknown. The general store near the park entrance was exactly what I expected. Dusty shelves, flickering neon lights, and a cashier who looked like he'd seen too much. As I grabbed a pack of jerky and a map, an older man leaned against the counter, his hunter orange vest frayed at the edges. "You camping out here alone?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yep," I replied, folding the map. The man snorted. "You ever hear about the thing that lives out here?" I raised an eyebrow. "The Wendigo?" His expression darkened. "Call it what you want, but it ain't natural. It don't just kill, it hunts, mimics, likes to play with its food. You hear it call your name, you run." I smiled politely and paid for my things. I'd heard plenty of stories like his before, but there was something about his tone, dead serious, almost pleading, that sent a shiver down my spine. The campsite was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering trees, miles from the nearest road. No phone service, no neighbors, just the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the last person on Earth. I set up my gear, trail cameras, a recorder, my hunting knife strapped to my belt. By the time I started a small fire, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The first night passed uneventfully. A barred owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and the occasional crackle of the fire kept me company. I slept soundly, dreaming of nothing in particular. It was the second night when things got strange. I woke to a sound I couldn't place. At first, I thought it was the wind, but no, it was heavier, more deliberate. Crunch, crunch, footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing moved, but the forest felt alive, like it was holding its breath. I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe a raccoon, nosing around my campsite. Then came the growl. Low, guttural, and close. Too close. My stomach tightened as I turned the flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught something. A flash of yellow eyes, too high off the ground to belong to any animal I'd ever seen. The light flickered, and when it steadied, the eyes were gone. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The next day, I followed the tracks I found near my camp. They were deep, clawed, and much larger than any predator native to Ohio. They led deeper into the forest, winding past twisted trees and patches of scorched earth. That's when I found the clearing. The trees here were blackened and split, as though struck by lightning. Bones, animal and otherwise, were scattered across the ground, some gnawed clean, others broken as if by massive jaws. A strange symbol was carved into a nearby tree, jagged and crude, like a warning. I pulled out my camera, snapping photos and recording every detail. Adrenaline buzzed through me. This was it, the kind of evidence that could make my name in the cryptid community. But as the sun dipped lower, the forest seemed to change. The air grew colder, the shadows longer. A feeling of dread settled over me, like I was being watched. Back at camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The growling started again as soon as the fire died down, circling the campsite. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. The growling stopped. For a moment, the forest was silent. Then I heard it. "Marcus?" The voice was raspy, unnatural, but unmistakably mine. "Marcus!" it called again, drawing the word out like a taunt. I grabbed my hunting knife, backing toward the RV. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, my flashlight cutting through the trees. That's when I saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in shadow. It was gaunt and skeletal, its gray skin stretched tight over its bones. Antlers jutted from its head, twisted and jagged, and its glowing yellow eyes burned like embers. It moved with an unnatural grace, stepping into the light as if daring me to react. Its mouth opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "Marcus," it whispered, its voice echoing in my head. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just sprinted for the RV and slammed the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked every window and grabbed the flare gun from the glove compartment. The growling returned, louder now, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against metal. The RV rocked as the creature slammed into the side, leaving deep gouges in the aluminum. I fired a flare through the window, the bright light illuminating the clearing. The creature recoiled with an unearthly scream, its antlers catching fire as it stumbled back into the trees. For a moment, everything was still. Then the whispers began again, surrounding the RV, each voice more distorted than the last. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally broke, the forest seemed almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened. The scratches on the RV and the torn-up ground around the clearing were the only signs that it wasn't a nightmare. I didn't stick around to find out more. By the time the sun was fully up, I was driving out of Zaleski as fast as the RV could manage. At a ranger station near the edge of the forest, I tried to explain what I'd seen. The rangers listened politely, but dismissed it as a bear encounter. "Stress can play tricks on your mind," one of them said. But I knew better. When I got home, I reviewed the footage from my camera. Most of it was corrupted, static-filled, and distorted. But one frame was clear. The creature's face, its glowing eyes staring directly into the lens. I haven't gone camping since. I had no business being in Blood Creek. If I'd known what would happen, I would have turned the RV around and driven to the nearest crowded campground. But after the year I'd had, all I wanted was solitude. Just me, the woods, and the soft trickle of water to drown out the noise in my head. It was late afternoon when I pulled into the dirt lot at the edge of the creek. The drive through southeastern Ohio had been quiet. The scenery a blur of rolling hills and skeletal trees. Blood Creek was tucked away in the Appalachian foothills, isolated enough that cell service flickered and died miles before I arrived. Exactly what I was looking for. The creek itself was beautiful. Its crystal-clear water reflected the golden light of the setting sun, and a canopy of branches swayed gently overhead. There wasn't another soul in sight. I parked the RV and stepped out, breathing in the cool autumn air. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of peace. My first stop had been Maggie's bait shop, a small sagging shack about 10 miles from the creek. I'd planned to fish while I was there, so I stopped to grab some supplies. Maggie, the shop's owner, was a wiry older woman with sharp eyes and a smoker's rasp. "Blood Creek, huh?" she said when I mentioned my destination. Her tone was light, but something shifted in her expression. "Yeah," I replied. "It's supposed to be pretty quiet out there." Her gaze darkened. "Quiet, sure. But people don't camp there. Not anymore." I laughed nervously. "Why's that?" Maggie leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That place ain't right. Not since her." "Her?" Maggie just shook her head and muttered something about bad luck before ringing me up. I didn't push for details. I'd heard enough local legends in my time to know they were mostly tall tales. But as I left the shop, her words clung to me, nagging at the back of my mind. The first night passed uneventfully. I made myself a simple dinner, sat by the water until the stars came out, and crawled into bed, lulled by the soft gurgle of the creek. I didn't dream that night, or if I did, I didn't remember it. The second night was different. I woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding for no reason I could explain. At first, I thought a noise had startled me awake, but the RV was silent. Outside, the forest was still. Too still. I glanced out the window. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the clearing. Something moved at the edge of the creek, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. A figure, tall and thin, with long dark hair trailing down its back. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I brushed off the strange vision as leftover stress. I spent the day exploring the woods, following the creek as it wound through the trees. It was easy to see why people loved this place. The air was crisp, the colors vibrant, and the isolation felt like a balm on my frayed nerves. That evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I noticed something strange outside the RV. Etched into the dirt near the door was a symbol I didn't recognize. It was crude but deliberate, a circle with jagged lines radiating from its center. I knelt to get a closer look, but the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the ground. When I looked back, the symbol was gone. That night, the dreams began. In the dream, I was standing at the edge of the creek, the water black and still. A woman stood across from me, her figure half hidden by shadows. Her eyes were hollow pits, and her mouth moved soundlessly as she held out a twisted bundle of twigs bound with strands of dark hair. I woke gasping, my chest tight. The RV was dark and silent, but my heart hammered like I'd just sprinted a mile. The next day, I returned to Maggie's shop. She looked surprised to see me. "Thought you'd be long gone by now," she said, eyeing me warily. "Something weird happened last night," I said, hesitating before describing the dream and the strange symbol. Maggie's expression hardened. She lit a cigarette, her hands shaking slightly. "I told you that place ain't right," she muttered. "She's always looking." "Looking for what?" "Someone to take her place," Maggie said. "They say she was a witch, drowned in that creek centuries ago. Now she haunts it, cursing anyone who stays too long." "That's ridiculous," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Maggie shrugged, blowing a stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "Stay another night and you'll see." Despite her warning, I couldn't bring myself to leave. I told myself it was stubbornness, but deep down I needed to know if it was all in my head. That night, I stoked the fire higher than usual, its warm glow keeping the encroaching darkness at bay. The dreams came again, more vivid this time. I was being dragged toward the creek by an unseen force, my feet scraping against the muddy ground. The woman's face loomed above me, her empty eyes piercing through my soul. I woke to find myself standing barefoot at the edge of the creek. My heart stopped when I looked down at my hands. The twisted bundle from my dream was there, real and solid. Twigs and hair bound tightly with a strip of leather. The forest seemed to hold its breath as I stumbled back toward the RV, clutching the bundle like it might bite. My legs shook, and the whispers started again, faint but growing louder with every step. "Come to me," they said, the words slithering through the trees. Back in the RV, I slammed the door shut and locked it. The whispers pressed against the walls, growing louder until they were deafening. I clutched the bundle, unsure of what to do. The fire outside flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness. Panic clawed at my chest as the air grew thick and cold. The woman appeared outside the window, her face pale and distorted, her hollow eyes boring into mine. "Come to me," she whispered, her voice filling the RV. I screamed and hurled the bundle into the fire pit outside. The flames roared to life, consuming the bundle in an instant. The woman shrieked, a sound that rattled through my bones, before vanishing into the night. The whispers stopped. The RV was silent. At dawn, I left Blood Creek without looking back. The forest was quiet as I drove away, but the unease lingered. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the nightmare had ended. Days later, I found the bundle under my pillow. It was intact, untouched by the flames. I stared at it for a long time, my reflection in the window catching my attention. My eyes, once bright and full of life, were hollow and dark, just like hers. The witch wasn't gone. She was waiting. The first thing I noticed about Mirror Lake was its silence. It wasn't the absence of sound that unnerved me. It was the kind of silence that made your ears strain, expecting something to fill the void. The lake stretched before me like a polished mirror, perfectly still, reflecting the trees, sky, and my RV parked at its edge. The place was beautiful, no doubt about it. I'd come here to focus on my wildlife photography, to capture a portfolio's worth of images of the birds and deer that frequented the area. More than that, I'd come to get away. From the city, from the noise, and especially from the memories of the breakup I couldn't quite shake. Perfect spot, I muttered to myself, unloading my camera gear and setting up my tripod. The reflection of the forest in the lake's surface was flawless. So sharp it was hard to tell where reality ended and the mirrored world began. A local hiker had passed me earlier on the trail, an older man with a face like crumpled paper. He'd paused to warn me, his voice low and serious. "Don't stare at the lake too long. They say it stares back." I'd laughed it off, assuming he was indulging in local folklore. But now, standing at the water's edge, I understood why someone might think that. The lake seemed alive in its stillness, watching. The next morning, I was up before dawn, eager to capture the first light. The lake was blanketed in mist, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. I crouched by the water with my camera, focusing on a great blue heron perched on a log. As I adjusted the lens, something caught my eye. The reflection in the water didn't match what I saw above it. The heron was missing from the mirrored scene. I glanced up and back down, convinced I was imagining things, but the discrepancy remained. I told myself it was the angle or the light, a trick of the water. I snapped a few shots and moved on, though unease itched at the back of my mind. That evening, I set up my camera for a time-lapse shot of the sunset. I sat by the fire reviewing the day's photos on my laptop. That's when I saw it. In one frame, a figure stood on the far side of the lake. My stomach dropped. It was unmistakably me. The posture, the outline of my jacket, even the tilt of my head. But I hadn't been on that side of the lake. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the shoreline. The figure was gone, but I found something else. Footprints. Barefoot impressions leading to the edge of the water, then disappearing. I backed away slowly, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. Nothing stirred, but the lake's surface rippled slightly, as if something had just dipped beneath. The next day, I couldn't concentrate. Every snap of a twig made me jump, and I kept glancing over my shoulder as I hiked the trails. The forest was too quiet, the air too still. Near a patch of wildflowers, I froze. Across the lake, the figure was there again, standing motionless. This time, it waved. It was a slow, deliberate gesture, almost mocking. My breath caught as I realized something was wrong with the way it moved. Its arms seemed to bend at an unnatural angle, the motion too smooth, too fluid. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the water. The figure didn't respond. It simply turned and walked into the lake, vanishing beneath the surface without a splash. I spent the rest of the day at the visitor center, searching for answers. The ranger on duty raised an eyebrow when I asked about Mirror Lake. "Most folks don't camp near the lake," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "You might have heard the stories." I pressed her, and she finally relented. There was a settler, back in the 1800s, who claimed the lake reflected another world. He became obsessed, said he could see his better self in the water. Tried to cross into the reflection. They found him drowned a few days later. She hesitated before adding, "Others have reported seeing reflections that don't match reality. They say the lake wants to pull you in, to take your place." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to know what was really happening. That night, I sat by the lake, armed with my flashlight and camera. The water was calm, the stars reflecting perfectly in its surface. I crouched by the edge, staring into the mirrored world. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed my reflection wasn't mimicking me. When I tilted my head, it stayed still. When I raised my arm, it didn't follow. The water rippled, and the reflection grinned, a wide, toothy smile that didn't belong to me. I scrambled back as the reflection began to move, stepping out of the water and onto the shore. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a copy of me, but wrong. Its eyes were hollow, its movements too smooth like a puppet on strings. "You've been looking for answers," it said, its voice a warped version of my own. "Why not stay? I'll take care of things for you." I backed away, shaking my head. "You're not real." The doppelganger laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "I'm as real as you are, maybe more. I could live your life better, you know, no mistakes, no regrets." It stepped closer, its movements fluid and predatory. "All you have to do is let me." I turned and ran toward the RV, but it was faster. Its hand, cold and damp like the lake itself, grabbed my arm, pulling me back. Its strength was inhuman, and I felt myself being dragged toward the water. "You don't belong here," it hissed. "This world isn't yours." I struggled, kicking and clawing, but it only laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the still night. My hand brushed against my camera bag, and I remembered the lens, smooth, reflective. I grabbed the camera and shoved it toward the doppelganger's face. It recoiled, hissing as its own reflection stared back at it. I didn't waste the opportunity. I broke free and grabbed every reflective object I could find. My camera, a metal water bottle, even the shards of a broken mirror I'd brought for light manipulation. I hurled them into the lake, disrupting the glassy surface. The doppelganger screamed, its voice warping into something guttural and inhuman. Its body dissolved into ripples, sinking back into the water. The lake stilled, its surface once again a perfect mirror. At dawn, I packed up and left without looking back. The road out of the park felt impossibly long, the trees pressing in on either side. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. For a split second, I saw it, my reflection, smirking back at me. Then it was gone, leaving only my pale, terrified face staring back. I don't think I'll ever camp by a lake again. When I pulled into Salt Fork State Park, the late afternoon sunlight slanted through the trees, casting long shadows over the dirt road. The dense forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the occasional chirping of birds, the only sound breaking the stillness. It was exactly what I needed. I parked the RV at the edge of a remote campsite, far from the main trails. I wasn't here for the typical tourist attractions. My goal was to catalog the flora of the park, photographing, documenting, and maybe even finding a new plant species. Work had been suffocating lately, and I needed a break. The divorce, well, that was a story for another time. As I set up camp, the ranger I'd spoken to earlier came to mind. His parting words had been odd. Avoid the screaming woods. Locals say they're cursed. Nonsense, of course, but still, don't wander too deep. I had dismissed him with a polite nod, but the name stuck with me. Screaming Woods. It had the air of a campfire story, a ghost tale to entertain kids. Still, as I looked out at the forest stretching around me, I couldn't deny the uneasy weight of silence hanging in the air. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire, sipping tea and flipping through my notebook. The flame crackled, warm against the cool night air. The forest around me was almost unnaturally quiet. No rustling, no chirping, just the soft hiss of the wind. And then I heard it. A scream, distant but piercing, shattered the stillness. It didn't sound human, or at least not entirely. It was guttural, high-pitched, and drawn out, like an animal in pain. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, scanning the darkness beyond the campfire. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating their rough, scarred bark. My pulse quickened as the scream echoed again, closer this time. "Hello?" I called out, stepping toward the woods. My voice felt small, swallowed by the towering trees. There was no answer. The scream stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I stayed outside for another hour, my flashlight sweeping the trees, but nothing stirred. Finally, I retreated to the RV, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was just an animal, a bobcat maybe, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. The next day, I decided to stick to my original plan, cataloging plant species. The scream had rattled me, sure, but I wasn't about to let a weird noise ruin my trip. I took my notebook and camera and followed a narrow trail deeper into the woods. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, the trees towering and majestic, their leaves filtering the sunlight into soft green hues. But as I moved further in, something changed. The air grew heavier, the forest darker. The trees seemed different here, scarred and twisted, their bark marred by deep gashes. Dark sap oozed from some of the wounds, almost like the trees were bleeding. Then I heard it. A faint hum, so low I thought I was imagining it. But as I stood still, listening, the hum grew louder, forming soft, whispering words. I couldn't make out the language, but the sound set my teeth on edge. The wind, I told myself, just the wind. Still, I quickened my pace, moving away from the gnarled trees and their haunting whispers. When I reached a clearing, I sat down to collect myself, my hands trembling as I jotted notes. I couldn't ignore the creeping sense that something was wrong with this forest. That evening, I was cleaning up after dinner when I spotted something near the edge of my campsite. A small book tucked under the roots of a tree. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up carefully. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed and brittle. Inside, handwritten notes filled the margins in shaky script. It was a journal, written by someone who had worked in the forest decades ago. The entries were frantic, almost incoherent, describing strange screams and disappearances. "The trees are alive," one entry read. "They remember the blood, the pain, they're angry." Another passage chilled me to the bone. "Stay away from the gashes. They're marks of vengeance. We should have left the forest alone." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. My logical mind fought to dismiss it as the ravings of an old logger, but deep down I felt the truth of his words. The next day, I ventured into the forest again, determined to finish my cataloging. I told myself I was overreacting, letting the journal and the screams get into my head. But the forest didn't feel the same. The air was heavy, the trees pressing in closer. The scarred trunks seemed more numerous, their gashes deeper. As I bent down to photograph a cluster of ferns, a branch snapped loudly above me, crashing to the ground just feet away. I jumped back, heart pounding. It wasn't just a coincidence, the branch had fallen with intent. I hurried back toward the trail, but the roots seemed to shift beneath my feet, tripping me. I landed hard, scraping my palms. The whispers started again, louder this time, and I swore I heard my name among them. "Daniel," they hissed. "Daniel." I ran. That night, the screaming returned. louder and more desperate than before. I stayed inside the RV, peering through the windows, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then I saw it. At the edge of the firelight stood a figure, a humanoid shape made of bark and vines, its eyes glowing a faint green. It stood motionless, watching me, its hollow gaze boring into my soul. I wanted to run, to hide, but my body was frozen in place. When I blinked, the figure was gone, replaced by the silence of the woods, the truth of the screaming trees. The next morning, I sought out the park's visitor center, hoping to find answers. A woman there, older and kind-faced, listened patiently as I described what I'd seen. Her expression darkened. "You've been near the Screaming Woods," she said. "That land, it was sacred once. The settlers didn't listen. They tore down the trees, built over the land, and destroyed what they didn't understand." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The forest remembers. Those scars you saw on the trees? They're marks of the settlers' crimes. The forest fights back against anyone who doesn't respect it." That night, the forest came for me. Branches scraped against the RV's windows, roots breaking through the ground and curling around the tires. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices demanding my attention. In my dreams, I stood in the heart of the forest, surrounded by the towering, scarred trees. A voice boomed in my mind, "Restore or suffer, the choice is yours." When I woke, the RV was still surrounded. I knew what I had to do, Daniel's redemption. I gathered supplies and returned to the scarred trees. One by one, I worked to fill the gashes, packing them with sap and soil. I whispered apologies as I worked, promising to respect the forest, to tell its story. As the dawn broke, the forest seemed to calm. The whispers faded, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I left Salt Fork State Park that day, my heart lighter but my mind troubled. As I drove away, I noticed a small sapling near my campsite, its bark smooth except for one detail: my name, faintly etched into its trunk. I don't know if the forest forgave me, but I know it will never forget. I didn't come to the forest to be haunted. I came to forget. The sun was setting when I parked the RV in a small clearing, far enough from the main campground that I wouldn't hear the chatter of families or see the glow of campfires. I needed quiet, a space to untangle my thoughts. The past month at work had been a train wreck. Another code blue, another patient I couldn't save, their faces blurred together now, a collage of failure etched into my memory. The forest seemed like a balm for that. Towering trees, the soft murmur of the Clear Fork River somewhere in the distance. I took a deep breath, letting the clean air fill my lungs. Maybe here I could finally breathe again. After setting up camp, I decided to explore before it got too dark. The trailhead nearby led to Moonville Tunnel, an old railway passage I'd read about online. Supposedly haunted, but I didn't buy into that nonsense. Still, it would make for a good story to tell later. The trail was quiet, except for the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. When I reached the tunnel, the sight was surreal. A gaping black mouth surrounded by moss-covered stone, its archway covered in graffiti. The air was cooler here, a sudden drop in temperature that raised goosebumps on my skin. I stepped inside, pulling out my phone to snap a picture. That's when I heard it, a faint, melodic hum, like someone singing a hymn. I froze, the hairs on my neck standing up. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing. The singing stopped. I shone my flashlight down the tunnel, the beam cutting through the gloom. At the far end, something flickered. A light, faint and yellow, like an old lantern swaying in the breeze. "Is someone there?" No answer. The light vanished as quickly as it appeared. I swallowed hard and backed out of the tunnel, the weight of unseen eyes pressing on my back. Night fell quickly in the forest. I cooked a quick dinner on the camp stove, trying to shake off the unease from the tunnel. It was probably just a trick of the light, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when the knocking started. 3 soft taps, like a child at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, fumbling with the switch. "Who's there?" I called. No answer. I hesitated, then crept to the door and cracked it open. A boy stood there, pale and thin, dressed in clothes that looked decades old. His eyes were sunken, and his lips trembled as he spoke. "Please don't forget us," he said. The words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, the boy turned and ran into the woods, his small frame swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of the boy. I walked the perimeter of my campsite, searching for any sign of him. That's when I noticed the carvings on the trees. Names. Dozens of them, etched into the bark in jagged letters. Some were accompanied by dates, others by strange symbols I didn't recognize. One name stood out. Eleanor. My name. The carving was fresh, the edges of the letters still raw and oozing sap. I stumbled back, heart racing. Needing answers, I drove into the nearest town and found the public library. It didn't take long to find records of disappearances tied to the forest. Many of the names matched the ones I'd seen on the trees. People who'd vanished without a trace, their cases long forgotten. A librarian, an older woman with a kind face, noticed my growing pile of newspaper clippings. "You've been to Moonville Tunnel, haven't you?" she asked. I nodded. She hesitated, glancing around before leaning in close. "The forgotten ones," she whispered. "Spirits of those who disappeared in the forest. They can't move on because no one remembers them." Her words lingered as I drove back to camp. That night, the footsteps began. I was sitting by the campfire when I heard them, soft and deliberate, circling the RV. I shone my flashlight into the trees, but the beam caught only shadows. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. No answer. The footsteps stopped, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. I locked the RV door and huddled inside, my heart pounding. Sleep was impossible. My dreams were vivid and horrifying. Wandering the forest, lost, while voices whispered my name. When I woke, the name Eleanor was carved into the side of the RV. The boy appeared again the next evening, standing just beyond the firelight. "Why are you following me?" I demanded, gripping my flashlight tightly. "We want to be remembered," he said, his voice trembling. "Please help us." Before I could respond, shadows merged from the trees. Dozens of figures, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes hollow. They surrounded the campsite, their forms flickering like static images. I stumbled back, panic clawing at my chest. "What do you want?" "Say our names," they whispered in unison. "Tell our stories." I returned to the tunnel, hoping to find a way to help them. The air inside was suffocating, heavy with an unnatural chill. The shadows followed me, their whispers growing louder. At the far end of the tunnel, a shape emerged, tall, inhuman, a mass of darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe. The entity. It spoke without words, its voice invading my mind. Leave, or stay forever. I refused to run. I gathered the personal items scattered throughout the tunnel, rusted jewelry, scraps of fabric, and carried them back to the campsite. Under the starlit sky, I built a circle of candles and laid the items within. One by one, I read the names aloud from the clippings I'd found, my voice shaking but steady. The shadows gathered around me, their forms more solid now. The boy stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered as his body began to fade. The entity screamed, a sound that ripped through the air like thunder. It surged toward me, but the light of the candles flared bright, forcing it back. The shadows disappeared, and the forest fell silent. The carvings were gone the next morning, the bark of the trees smooth and unmarked. I drove away, the weight of the forest lifting with each mile. But at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear the boy's voice. "Please don't forget us." I came to Tar Hollow State Forest to find myself again. After the accident, I'd lost my confidence, my edge. Guiding people through the wilderness had been my passion, but that day, when the storm came out of nowhere and I made the wrong call, left me shaken. Now, I felt like an imposter, a fraud who couldn't trust her own instincts. The forest was supposed to help me. Its quiet strength, its endless trails, its simplicity. I needed that. I parked my RV at a secluded site near Pine Lake, away from the few other campers who might still be around this late in the season. The forest was a cocoon of orange and gold, the leaves starting their slow march toward winter. It was beautiful, peaceful, until it wasn't. The first night started with the light. I was sitting by the fire watching the flames dance and listening to the occasional rustle of the forest when I noticed it. A faint glow deep in the trees, bobbing gently like a firefly. At first, I thought it was someone with a flashlight, another camper maybe, or a park ranger making rounds. But the light didn't behave like it should. It moved too smoothly, weaving between the trees in slow, deliberate arcs. I stood, trying to get a better look. "Hello?" I called, my voice cutting through the stillness. The light paused. For a moment, it hung there, hovering just beyond the firelight's reach, before slowly drifting farther into the forest. "Okay," I muttered to myself. "Weird, but probably nothing." Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept up my spine. I doused the fire, locked the RV door, and crawled into bed. The next day, I tried to push the memory of the light away. I hiked along the Pine Run Trail, letting the rhythm of my steps and the crisp autumn air clear my head. That's when I met Jared. He was standing at the edge of the trail, staring out over the ravine below. Tall, with a scruffy beard and a pack that looked like it had seen better days, he greeted me with a casual nod. "Not many people out here this time of year," he said, his voice warm but edged with something I couldn't quite place. "Yeah," I replied, "it's nice. Quiet." We fell into step together, and as we walked, he started talking about the forest, the trails, the wildlife, the history. It was clear he knew the place well. "Ever heard of the Lantern Man?" he asked suddenly, his tone shifting. "The what?" He gestured to the trees around us. "It's an old story. Supposedly there's a ghost that haunts these woods, a man carrying a lantern, searching for lost souls. People say he died out here a long time ago, and now he leads others to their deaths." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "That sounds like something out of a campfire story." Jared shrugged. "Maybe, but a lot of people have seen the light." He glanced at me. "If you do, don't follow it, no matter what." That night, the light came back. I was in bed, half asleep when I saw it through the window. A faint glow drifting between the trees. My heart started to pound. It was the same light as before, but this time it was closer. The whispers began a moment later. Soft, faint, just on the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the longer I listened, the clearer they became. "Claire," they murmured. "Come." I froze. How did they know my name? The light moved closer, the whispers growing louder. My head throbbed with their insistent pull, like they were burrowing into my skull. Before I knew what I was doing, I was out of bed, slipping on my boots, and stepping out into the night. The forest was suffocating in its silence. The light hovered just ahead, its glow soft and steady. The whispers guided me, their words a jumbled mixture of pleas and commands. I followed the light down an overgrown path, my legs moving of their own accord. The air grew colder, heavier, the trees pressing in around me like they were alive. And then I saw it. A small cemetery, hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by a crumbling stone wall. The graves were old, their markers weathered and leaning. In the center of the cemetery hung a rusted lantern, its glass cracked, but its light still burning. The whispers stopped. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the creak of the lantern swinging gently in the breeze. I took a step closer. "Don't," a voice behind me warned. I spun around, my flashlight catching Jared's face. "How? What are you doing here?" I stammered. "You need to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." "What's going on? What is this place?" Jared didn't answer. He grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the lantern. But before we could leave, the forest erupted with light. The lantern man appeared. He was tall and gaunt, his body shrouded in tattered fabric that seemed to shift and writhe like smoke. His face was obscured, but his eyes burned with a pale, ghostly light. The whispers started again, louder now, filling my head with static. "Claire," the lantern man said, his voice a low, rumbling growl. "Stay." I couldn't move, and the light from his lantern wrapped around me like a tether, pulling me toward him. My legs felt like lead, my mind clouded with fear and confusion. Jared shouted something, but I couldn't hear him over the roar of the whispers. The lantern man raised his hand, and the light grew brighter, blinding. I don't know how I broke free. Maybe it was Jared pulling me away. Maybe it was something inside me, some primal survival instinct kicking in. All I know is that one moment I was frozen, and the next I was running. We tore through the forest, the lantern man's glow chasing us, the whispers clawing at my mind. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. When we finally reached the RV, I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. Jared was gone. The forest was still when I woke the next morning. The light, the whispers, the lantern man, they were gone. But the memory of them lingered, a weight I couldn't shake. I left Tar Hollow that day, vowing never to return. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I see a faint glow in the distance, and I wonder if the lantern man is still waiting for me. When I left the city, I was desperate for peace. After a messy divorce and years spent staring at screens, I wanted silence. Real silence. Not the muffled hum of traffic or the constant buzz of electronics, but the quiet only nature could offer. That's how I ended up in Mohican State Park, alone in my old RV parked on the edge of the Clear Fork Gorge. The park was stunning, especially in the late afternoon light. Trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their leaves a tapestry of green and gold. The air smelled clean, untouched by asphalt or fumes. It was perfect, at least at first. The first day was uneventful. I hiked the main trails, snapping a few photos with my phone, and spent the evening cooking a simple meal on my RV's small stove. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a rare kind of contentment. This was what I needed. No emails, no ex-wife, no one telling me what to do or who to be, just me in the woods. But by the second day, things began to feel off. It started when I noticed the trail. I'd been walking back to my RV after an hour-long hike when I spotted it, a faint path branching off the main one, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. It was narrow, barely more than a line of packed dirt, and it twisted sharply into the woods. Something about it tugged at me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just tired of the predictability of the main trails. Whatever it was, I stepped off the beaten path and onto the faint trail. The air felt different as I walked, heavier, quieter. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. After a few minutes, I found the ruins. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I saw the remains of a chimney and the rotting beams of what must have been a small cabin. A rusted metal lantern sat in the dirt, its handle broken. The ground was littered with shards of pottery and what looked like animal bones. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Someone lived out here? I muttered to myself. The idea seemed impossible. This part of the park was miles from any road, and the trail was nearly invisible. Why would anyone build a cabin here? I snapped a photo and turned back toward the RV, eager to put the strange scene behind me. That night, the noises started. I'd just crawled into bed when I heard it. A faint snapping sound like someone stepping on a twig. I froze, my heart pounding. Raccoons, I told myself. Or maybe deer. I wasn't exactly deep in the wilderness. Wildlife was normal. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to an animal. They circled the RV, crunching the dry leaves and stopping occasionally, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was listening. I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door, shining the beam into the trees. "Hello?" I called, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Is someone out there?" The forest stared back at me, silent and empty. After a few minutes, I retreated inside, locking the door and double-checking the windows. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and I convinced myself it was just a hiker passing through. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, I stopped by the visitor center to report the strange noises. Leah, the park guide on duty, greeted me with a friendly smile that faltered when I described what I'd heard. "You were near the old trapper's cabin, weren't you?" she asked, her voice low. I blinked. "Trapper's cabin?" She nodded. "It's an old story. Back in the early 1900s, a man built a cabin deep in the woods, far from anyone else. They say he was reclusive, didn't trust people. One day, he just vanished. No one knows what happened, but some locals think his ghost still wanders the forest." I couldn't help but laugh. "Ghosts? Come on." Leah shrugged. "Believe what you want, but I'd stay away from that area if I were you. People say the forest gets strange near the cabin." I left the visitor center feeling annoyed. Ghost stories were fine for campfire entertainment, but I wasn't about to let a local legend ruin my weekend. That night, the disturbances grew worse. I was halfway through dinner when the lights in the RV flickered and went out. I swore under my breath, grabbing a flashlight to check the breaker. As I fumbled with the panel, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, circling the RV like a predator sizing up its prey. The flashlight beam caught something on the ground. Footprints, human footprints, large and deep, as if whoever made them was heavy. My breath caught in my throat. "Okay," I muttered, trying to steady myself. "Someone's messing with me." Grabbing my hiking boots, I stepped outside, determined to confront whoever was out there. But the second I stepped into the clearing, the forest fell silent. No footsteps, no rustling leaves. Just an oppressive stillness that pressed against my ears. That's when I saw the first figure. It was pale and thin, barely more than a shadow against the trees. It stood perfectly still, its face obscured by darkness. Then it moved, not toward me but away, disappearing into the woods without a sound. I didn't follow. Instead, I locked myself in the RV and sat by the window, gripping a kitchen knife and watching the forest until dawn. By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind. I had to go back to the cabin. I needed answers. The trail felt even more oppressive in the daylight. The air was thick and the silence was absolute. When I reached the clearing, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A small, rusted knife lying in the dirt. Next to it was a notebook, its cover warped with age. I picked it up carefully, flipping through the yellowed pages. Most of the writing was illegible, but a few sentences stood out, scrawled in jagged letters. It watches from the trees. Don't disturb the woods. The forest is alive. A chill ran down my spine. As I turned to leave, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. The dirt rippling like water. The trees creaked, their branches twisting unnaturally. And then I felt it. A presence. Something unseen, massive and ancient, watching me from every direction. I ran. The RV was my only sanctuary, but even there, I wasn't safe. The lights flickered, the floor trembled, and the air grew thick with the stench of damp earth. Through the window I saw the pale figure again, joined by others, shadows slipping between the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The ground beneath the RV began to groan, roots writhing like snakes. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the engine would start. It roared to life and I slammed my foot on the gas. As the RV lurched forward, the figures began to move, their blank faces turning toward me. The roots clawed at the tires, but the momentum was enough to break free. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest shrinking in my rearview mirror. I never went back to Mohican State Park. Whatever was in those woods, it didn't want me there, and I was more than happy to stay away. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the forest. I hear footsteps outside my window and I swear I can feel its eyes on me. The forest doesn't forget, and neither do I. I didn't choose Shawnee State Forest because of its history or reputation. In fact, I knew nothing about it when I arrived. It was just a green blob on the map, far from cities, noise, and people. Exactly what I needed. After 40 years of working as a nurse, most of that time caring for others, I wanted to care for myself. The RV was my little rebellion, my escape pod. It wasn't much, an old model with a sagging mattress and a stove that only worked half the time, but it was freedom on wheels. That's how I ended up parked on a secluded patch of dirt in the shadow of Shawnee's towering oaks. The first 2 days were blissfully uneventful. I spent my time hiking, sketching birds, and letting the sounds of the forest wash over me. Every now and then I'd pass another hiker or see a ranger's truck rumble down the trail, but for the most part, I was alone. On the third day, while exploring a new trail, I noticed an overgrown path branching off into the woods. A massive oak tree marked the entrance, its trunk carved with strange, looping symbols. Curiosity tugged at me. I almost walked past it, but something about the tree and the path beyond drew me in. The air changed as I stepped onto the narrow trail, cooler and heavier. The birdsong quieted, leaving only the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional creak of branches overhead. The path led to a small clearing, where I found the remains of what must have been a settlement. The outlines of old foundations peeked through the moss, and a collapsed well sat in the center, surrounded by a ring of stones. Hanging from the trees were crude wooden figures, effigies, I realized, made from sticks and string. A chill ran down my spine. This must be one of those ghost town things, I muttered aloud, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. I turned back toward the main trail, shaking off the eerie feeling, but I couldn't quite forget the carvings on the tree or those strange wooden figures. That night, I was jolted awake by a faint whispering sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was something else. The voices were soft, high-pitched, like children murmuring just outside the RV. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. The whispering stopped. I fumbled for my flashlight and aimed it through the window. The beam caught the trees swaying gently in the breeze, but there was nothing else out there. Still, I locked the door and double-checked the windows before climbing back into bed. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, or maybe an animal. To prove to myself that I wasn't afraid, I hiked back to the strange path and followed it to the clearing again. Nothing had changed, except for one thing. The oak tree at the entrance had new carvings on it. Fresh ones. They weren't the looping symbols I'd seen before, but crude shapes that resembled stick figures. I pressed my fingers to the bark. The lines were shallow, as though they'd been made recently. "Okay, Beth," I said aloud, "you're freaking yourself out." But as I turned to leave, I saw a figure standing in the clearing. A child. At least, I thought it was a child. It was pale and small, with dark eyes that seemed too large for its face. "Hey," I called. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, staring at me. I took a cautious step forward, and it darted into the trees, moving so quickly that I couldn't see where it went. I chased after it, calling out, but within seconds I'd lost the trail. I was alone again. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, coming from every direction. I sat frozen in the RV, clutching a flashlight, too scared to move. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. I waited, straining my ears. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from under the RV like something, or someone, was scratching at the chassis. I climbed out of bed, my knees trembling, and crept toward the door. "Who's out there?" I called. The tapping stopped. When I finally mustered the courage to open the door, I found nothing but darkness and the faint rustle of leaves. The next day, I decided to leave. I told myself it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Before I left, I stopped by the ranger station to let someone know about the strange carvings and the child I'd seen. The man behind the desk, Paul, looked up from his paperwork and frowned. "You were at the old clearing?" "Yes," I said. "Why?" He scratched his head. "That place has been abandoned for a long time. People around here say it's cursed, but it's probably just stories." "What kind of stories?" He shrugged. "Settlers vanished from that area back in the 1800s. Some say they were killed, others say they just left. But there's this legend that the forest takes people, lures them in." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "You don't really believe that, do you?" Paul didn't answer. That evening, as I packed up my things, the whispers started again. This time, they weren't outside. They were inside the RV. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but the small space was empty. "Leave," a voice whispered. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. "Who's there?" I shouted. The voice didn't answer, but the RV began to shake. The floor trembled beneath my feet and the lights flickered. Suddenly, the pale figure of the child appeared at the window. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. "Please," the figure whispered, "you have to leave." Before I could respond, it vanished. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I started the RV and drove toward the exit as fast as I could. The forest blurred past me, and I felt a flicker of hope that I'd escape unscathed. Then the road disappeared. One moment I was following the dirt path, and the next it was gone. I slammed on the brakes, the RV skidding to a stop. The forest loomed around me, the trees seeming closer than before. And then I saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures standing between the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The ground beneath the RV began to tremble. I looked down and saw roots writhing like snakes, creeping toward the tires. "No," I whispered, "this isn't real." The roots coiled around the RV, pulling it downward. I slammed the accelerator, but the wheels spun uselessly. The figures stepped closer, their faces blank and featureless. I screamed, closing my eyes and gripping the steering wheel, waiting for the end. When I opened my eyes, I was sitting in a clearing. The RV was intact, the engine still running. The forest was silent. I didn't wait to question what had happened. I drove straight out of Shawnee State Forest and never looked back. Even now, months later, I still hear whispers sometimes, soft and faint, like leaves rustling in the wind. And I know the forest hasn't forgotten me. The trees at Wildcat Hollow were so dense they swallowed the daylight. I'd been in remote places before, but this felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As I pulled my RV into the secluded campsite, I reminded myself this was just another job. 2 weeks in the woods, tracking wildlife migration patterns, then back to the lab. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At the ranger station earlier, Evan, the local ranger, had been unusually chatty. He was wiry, with a weathered face and a nervous energy that made him seem out of place in the middle of nowhere. "You're staying near Wildcat Hollow?" he'd asked, his tone more serious than I expected. "Yes, perfect spot for my research," I'd replied, thinking he might offer useful advice about the trails. Instead, he leaned in. "Be careful out there. Folks around here talk about a witch." I laughed. "A witch?" "Yeah, she cursed the land a long time ago, or so they say. Crops withered, animals went mad, people got sick. They say she was hanged near the creek, but she didn't really die. Her spirit stayed behind." He hesitated. "Strange things happen around there." I'd smiled politely, but I didn't believe a word. My work required me to stay grounded in reality, and ghost stories didn't fit into that framework. Now, setting up my gear in the eerie quiet, I found myself replaying Evan's warning. The first night, I barely slept. My dreams were vivid and disjointed, shadows moving through the trees, whispers too faint to understand. I woke up drenched in sweat, the feeling of being watched sharper than before. The next morning, I headed out with my gear to explore the trails. The forest felt alive, but not in the way I'd expected. It wasn't just the rustle of leaves or the scurrying of animals. It was the stillness between the sounds, the way the silence seemed to pulse. On the second day, I found something strange, a pattern of ash in a perfect circle on the ground. At first, I thought it might be the remnants of a campfire, but there were no signs of burning. The ash was just there. Nearby, I saw a deer standing unnaturally still, its dark eyes locked on me. When I took a step forward, it didn't bolt like it should have. Instead, it walked away slowly, as if it wanted me to follow. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus on my work. But that night the dreams returned, stronger this time. The shadowy figure was closer, watching me from just beyond the firelight. By the third day, I was exhausted. My radio wasn't working and my phone couldn't get a signal. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I'd spent plenty of time alone in the field before, but this felt different. The animals were acting strange, too. A raccoon approached my RV in broad daylight, staring at me with glassy eyes. It didn't flinch when I moved closer. I decided to explore further down the Hollow Creek Trail. About a mile in, I stumbled across an abandoned cabin. Its roof sagged and moss covered the wooden walls, but it looked sturdy enough to have survived decades of weather. Inside, I found shelves filled with jars of dried herbs and something that made my skin crawl. Small carvings of twisted faces, each one staring up at me with hollow eyes. In the corner, an old book sat on a makeshift table, its pages yellowed and crumbling. The writing inside was in a language I didn't recognize, full of symbols that sent a chill through me. As I left the cabin, the air seemed heavier, like the forest was pressing down on me. That's when I smelled it. Burnt herbs, faint but distinct. The scent grew stronger as I neared my campsite, and when I arrived, the ash patterns were there again, this time circling the RV. That night, I woke to footsteps outside the RV. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. My breath hitched. Grabbing my flashlight, I shone it out the window, but the beam illuminated only empty trees. Then the footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint tapping on the door. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer, just the tapping. I grabbed the book I'd taken from the cabin and threw it into my pack. Something told me it was connected to whatever was happening, and I needed answers. I bolted outside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The ash circle was unbroken, and the forest was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. That's when I saw her. She stood at the edge of the woods, a gaunt figure with pale skin and hollow eyes. Her black dress fluttered as if caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. "You've taken enough," she said, her voice a rasp. I froze. "What are you talking about?" "You disturb the balance," she said, stepping closer. Her feet didn't touch the ground. "You tag, you take, you leave your mark. Now the forest marks you." "I'm just doing research," I stammered. But the air grew colder, and the smell of burning herbs was overwhelming. "I'll stop. I'll leave." "It's too late," she whispered, her voice seeming to come from all around me. "Unless you're willing to make a trade." The witch vanished, and the forest came alive. Roots burst from the ground, snaking toward me. Animals surrounded me, their eyes glowing in the dark. I ran blindly, clutching the pack with the book. Somehow, I found my way back to the cabin. Inside, the air was suffocating, and the symbols on the walls seemed to writhe. The witch's voice echoed in my head, "Restore the balance." I opened the book, desperate for answers. One page stood out, its symbols burning into my vision. The ritual was clear: burn what I had taken, destroy the tools I'd used, and leave a piece of myself behind. My hands shook as I piled the tracking devices and the book into a heap. I lit a match, and flames consumed the pile, the fire crackling unnaturally loud. The witch appeared again, her hollow eyes watching. "One more thing," she said. "What?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "A piece of yourself," she said, pointing at my arm. The firelight glinted off a knife on the table. I don't remember the pain, just the blood, pooling on the floor as the cabin shuddered around me. When I awoke, it was dawn, and the forest was quiet. The ash circles were gone. The animals had scattered, and the air felt lighter. I packed my things and left Wildcat Hollow that morning, the bandage on my arm a constant reminder of what I'd given. But even now, months later, I sometimes smell burnt herbs in the air. And at night, when I close my eyes, I see the witch standing in the forest, waiting. For what, I don't know. I've always found solace in solitude. It's why I took this trip in the first place. Just me, my RV, and the open road. After months of sleepless nights and a marriage that felt like it was unraveling by the day, I needed to get away. Mohican State Park seemed perfect. Remote, quiet, beautiful. A place where I could clear my head, reset, and figure out how to piece my life back together. I parked my RV near Hollow Creek Trail, far from the more popular campsites. As I set up camp, I noticed the silence. No birds, no wind. Just an oppressive stillness that felt heavy against my chest. I chalked it up to being out in nature alone. It wasn't eerie, it was peaceful, I told myself. Exactly what I needed. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire, cooked some food, and let the silence settle over me. But when I crawled into bed, my thoughts grew louder. Anna's face floated in my mind, her eyes filled with frustration during our last argument. "You're so good at shutting everyone out," she'd said, tears streaming down her face. "It's like you want to be alone." I'd snapped back, defensive and cruel. "Maybe I do." I hadn't spoken to her since. The guilt gnawed at me, but I forced it down. I was here to move on, not to dwell. But even as I drifted into sleep, I thought I heard footsteps crunching outside the RV. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind. Except there was no wind. The next day, I decided to hike Hollow Creek Trail. The ranger I'd spoken to earlier had warned me about it. "Not many people go that way anymore," he'd said. "Strange stories. You'd be better off sticking to the main trails." But that only intrigued me more. I liked a challenge, and besides, the stories were probably just local legends meant to scare off tourists. I wasn't a tourist. I was a survivalist. Someone who prided himself on his ability to handle anything nature threw at him. The trail was beautiful, but overgrown, winding through dense forest. I stopped to take in the quiet, snapping a few photos of the sun filtering through the trees. That's when I saw the carvings. They were etched into the bark of several trees along the trail. Crude faces, hollow-eyed and screaming. Something about them felt wrong, like they weren't meant to be seen. I touched one, running my fingers along the grooves, and shivered at how cold the bark was. "Don't touch those," a voice said. I spun around to see a woman standing a few feet away. She was pale, her hair tangled, and her clothes looked as though she'd been wandering the woods for days. "Who are you?" I asked. "Mara," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You need to leave." "What are you talking about?" "This place." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "It doesn't let people go. The Hollow Men, they see you now." I frowned. "Hollow Men?" "They feed on guilt, on regret. They'll take you if you let them." I didn't believe her, of course. She was probably just some local trying to scare me off. Still, something in her eyes unsettled me. Something that made me feel small and vulnerable in the vastness of the forest. "I'll be fine," I said, brushing past her. She didn't follow, but her warning stayed with me. That night, the woods seemed darker than before. The fire barely lit the clearing, its flames weak and sputtering. As I sat by the RV, I heard them again. Footsteps, circling just beyond the edge of the firelight. My stomach knotted, but I refused to show fear. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. "Who's there?" I called. Silence. I turned back toward the RV, and that's when I saw them. Faint handprints smeared across the windows. They hadn't been there earlier. My skin crawled. I locked the door and sat with my back against it, clutching my hunting knife. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the carvings, of faces with hollow eyes staring back at me. And always, I heard whispers, low, guttural voices calling my name. The next morning, I decided to confront whatever was out there. I packed my gear and set out for Hollow Creek Trail, determined to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The woods were silent again. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. The carvings were still there, more vivid than before. As I stared at them, I heard Mara's voice behind me. "You shouldn't have come back." I turned to see her standing in the middle of the trail, her face pale and drawn. "What's going on here?" I demanded. "Who are you, really?" "I tried to warn you," she said, "but it's too late now. They've marked you." "Who?" My voice rose, anger masking the fear gnawing at me. She pointed past me. I turned and froze. The Hollow men were there, standing in the shadows between the trees. They were tall and gaunt, their faces smooth and featureless. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. The air grew cold, and a faint smell of decay filled my nostrils. "They'll take you," Mara whispered, "unless you let go." "Let go of what?" "Your guilt," she said. "It's what they feed on. It's why they're here." I wanted to laugh, to tell her she was crazy. But the Hollow men stepped closer and my body refused to move. I heard Anna's voice then, clear as day. "You did this to us." The words cut through me like a blade. The memories I'd tried so hard to bury came rushing back. The nights I'd ignored her. The arguments I'd started. The pain I'd caused. I felt it all at once, and the weight of it brought me to my knees. The Hollow men surrounded me, their hollow faces inches from mine. I felt their cold breath against my skin, heard the low hum of their whispers. Mara's voice broke through the noise. "Say it," she urged. "Confess." "I'm sorry," I choked out. "I pushed her away. I couldn't—" My voice cracked. I couldn't let her in. The Hollow men stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then, one by one, they faded into the trees. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the trail near my RV. The sun was rising, casting golden light across the forest. Mara was gone, and the carvings were just faint scratches on the trees. I packed up and left without looking back. The drive home was quiet, the weight in my chest lighter than it had been in years. I wasn't sure if I'd escaped the curse or if it had given me a second chance. Months later, I returned to Hollow Creek. I needed closure to see if the carvings were still there. The trail was overgrown, as though no one had walked it in years. But the trees still bore the faint outlines of hollow faces, and the air was heavy with silence. As I traced one of the carvings, I heard a voice, a whisper, low and familiar. "Stay." The forest felt alive around me, and I realized I would never truly leave. The forest around Salt Fork State Park stretched endlessly, trees rising like sentinels into the autumn sky. I parked my RV in the last open spot near the lake, eager for solitude and inspiration. My plan was simple: a week of hiking, photographing the changing leaves, and maybe rediscovering the piece of myself I'd lost over the past year. The first 2 days were peaceful. The trails were stunning, each turn revealing new bursts of color. The air was crisp and invigorating, and I felt alive in a way I hadn't since leaving my corporate job. But by the 3rd day, a creeping unease settled over me. I first noticed it at the bait shop near the lake. An older man named Dave struck up a conversation while I was buying a map. He had leathery skin and a fisherman's easy grin, but his tone turned serious when he asked where I was staying. "Out by the lake," I said. "Near Hosak's cave." He frowned, shaking his head. "Be careful out there. There's a reason people don't camp alone in these parts." "Why's that?" "They say a hermit lives in those woods. Been there for decades, long after he went mad. Some folks think he's more than just a man now. The forest does strange things to people. I laughed it off, but his words stuck with me. That night, I lay awake in the RV, the wind rattling the trees outside. Every creak and groan of the RV's frame sounded unnaturally loud. Once, I swore I heard footsteps crunching the gravel outside, but when I peeked out the window, the campsite was empty. The next morning, I set out early with my camera, determined to shake the lingering fear. The forest was beautiful under the morning sun, golden light streaming through the canopy. I snapped dozens of photos. Dew on spider webs, the jagged bark of oaks, the reflection of the lake's glassy surface. I hiked toward Hosak's cave around midday. The trail was steeper than I'd anticipated, winding through thick brush. I almost missed the entrance, just a dark slash in the rock face barely visible beneath the moss. Stepping closer, I saw strange carvings etched into the stone. Spirals and stick figures, deeply grooved but weathered with age. I snapped a picture, though something about the symbols unsettled me. As I turned to leave, movement caught my eye. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. He was gaunt, his clothes tattered and hanging loosely from his frame. His face was shadowed, but I could feel his gaze locked on me. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing. He didn't respond, just stared. I slung my camera over my shoulder and backed away, my heart pounding. When I glanced back a moment later, he was gone. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The RV, usually a sanctuary, felt too small, too exposed. As darkness fell, the noises began again. Soft tapping on the windows, the faint crunch of gravel. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, but the beam illuminated nothing but empty forest. Then I noticed them. Handprints smeared faintly on the glass. My stomach turned. The prints were too large to be mine, and they hadn't been there earlier. The next morning, I debated leaving. I should have. But something about the man and the carvings gnawed at me. Who was he? Why had he been watching me? Against my better judgment, I decided to hike back to Hosak's cave, this time in the early afternoon. The trail felt different. The woods were silent, no rustling leaves or bird calls, only the crunch of my boots. As I approached the cave, I heard it. Faint murmurs, like voices carried on the wind. My name, whispered so softly I almost thought I imagined it. "Nina." I froze. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from the cave, but from deeper in the forest. Against every instinct, I followed them. The trail dissolved into dense underbrush, branches clawing at my arms and legs. The voices were clearer now, overlapping and chaotic. Some sounded like my mother, others like my ex-boyfriend. I stumbled into a clearing and gasped. The hermit stood at the center, his back to me. Around him were crude wooden effigies, tied with strips of cloth and hair. He turned slowly, his face hollowed and pale, his eyes dark pits. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a rasp. I didn't mean to intrude," I stammered, stepping back. "You're in it now," he said, taking a step closer. "The forest sees you. It doesn't let go." I turned and ran. I don't remember how I found my way back to the RV, only that my legs ached and my breath came in ragged gasps. I locked the doors and tried to calm myself, but the whispers followed, louder now. My name echoed from all directions. When night fell, I realized I wasn't safe. Shadows moved outside the windows and the tapping returned, rhythmic and deliberate. Then came the knocking, heavy and slow, rattling the RV. My camera sat on the table, its strap dangling over the edge. Desperate for proof, or maybe for a distraction, I picked it up. I scrolled through the photos from the day and froze. In every shot, the hermit was there, hiding in the background, behind trees, crouched near the cave, watching me. A loud thud jolted me from my seat. The door handle jiggled, my breath hitched. "Go away," I screamed. The handle stilled. A soft voice, barely audible, came from the other side. "Let me in, Nina." It wasn't the hermit's voice, it was mine. I didn't sleep that night, sitting with my back to the wall, clutching a kitchen knife. The knocking stopped after a while, but the whispers never did. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I started the RV and drove, not stopping until I reached the highway. But as I drove, the forest didn't seem to end. The road twisted endlessly through the same towering trees. My GPS flickered, the map refusing to load. It wasn't until I reached a rest stop that I allowed myself to breathe. The parking lot was empty, but it felt safer than the endless woods. I grabbed my camera, desperate to delete the photos. But as I scrolled, a new image appeared. It was me, sitting in the RV, staring at the camera. Behind me stood the hermit, his hollow eyes locked on mine. The last thing I remember is a tap on the window followed by a whisper, "Nina." The screen went black, and so did everything else. I parked my RV at a quiet corner of Salt Fork State Park, the lake glinting in the late afternoon sun. It was the perfect spot. Serene, scenic, and, most importantly, secluded. My latest children's book had stalled, and I hoped this trip would shake loose the creative cobwebs. Nature always had a way of whispering ideas to me, and the thought of using the park as inspiration for my next story felt promising. The first evening passed uneventfully. I spent it sketching ideas and jotting down notes about the park's landscape. But it wasn't until the second day, while wandering off the main trail, that I found the overgrown path. It wasn't marked, and the way the grass and underbrush had overtaken it told me it hadn't been used in years. My curiosity, ever my greatest strength and weakness, urged me forward. The path twisted and narrowed, the trees crowding closer as I ventured deeper. After about 20 minutes, I emerged into a clearing and stopped cold. Before me stood an abandoned playground. Rusty swings swayed faintly in the breeze, their chains groaning in protest. A half-collapsed merry-go-round sat crookedly on its axis, its faded red and yellow paint peeling like old wallpaper. Beyond the playground loomed a small cabin, its roof sagging, the door hanging half off its hinges. I raised my camera, taking pictures of the scene. The juxtaposition of childhood innocence and decay was haunting. It was exactly the kind of imagery I needed for my story. As I reviewed the photos, something made my skin prickle. There, in the background of one shot, was the faint outline of a child, a boy, standing near the swings. But when I looked up, the clearing was empty. My heart thudded. It had to be a trick of the light, or so I told myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the image of the boy on the swings, the details of the playground etched into my thoughts. Around midnight I heard it, a soft knock at the RV door. I froze, the pen in my hand hovering over my notebook. Another knock followed, louder this time. Cautiously, I moved to the door, peering out through the curtain. A boy stood there. He looked about 8 years old, with dark, curly hair and a solemn expression. His clothes were oddly old-fashioned, a white shirt with suspenders smudged with dirt. He looked up at me, his eyes impossibly wide. "Can you help me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened the door hesitantly. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" "They're not here," he said. "I'm looking for my friends. Can you help me find them?" Something about him unnerved me. Maybe it was the way his voice sounded hollow, or how he avoided my eyes after the first glance. But before I could respond, he turned and ran into the woods. "Wait!" I called after him. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and followed. The path led back to the playground. The swings creaked in the wind, and the shadows cast by the moon seemed darker here. I scanned the area, my flashlight beam dancing over the rusted equipment. The boy was nowhere to be seen. I stepped closer to the cabin, its door now swinging open as if inviting me in. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood and rot. My flashlight illuminated the walls, and I sucked in a breath. They were covered in crude drawings, childlike scribbles etched in black crayon, figures with hollow eyes, a large, shadowy man looming over smaller stick figures, children holding hands in a circle. I backed away, the hair on my arms standing on end. That's when I noticed the logbook on a dusty table. I flipped through its brittle pages, finding entries from the 1970s. It had been a caretaker's log, documenting routine maintenance of the playground. But the last few entries changed in tone, becoming frantic. 2 children missing. Authorities notified. Searched all night. No sign. More children gone. Something wrong with the water near the bridge. The final entry read, "They're not missing, they're here, and he won't let them leave." A chill ran down my spine. As I closed the logbook, I heard laughter. Faint, childlike giggles echoed from outside the cabin. I rushed out, heart pounding. The playground was empty, but the laughter continued, weaving between the trees. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment I saw them, shadowy figures darting between the trunks, too small and quick to be adults. The laughter turned cruel, mocking, as if the forest itself were toying with me. The next morning, I drove into town, desperate for answers. At the local cafe, I struck up a conversation with an older waitress, her name tag reading Lila. When I mentioned the playground, her face darkened. "That place should have been torn down years ago," she muttered, setting down my coffee. Kids started disappearing back in the 70s. They searched for weeks, but never found them. "What about the caretaker?" I asked, recalling the logbook. She hesitated before answering. There were rumors that he knew more than he let on. Some say he was obsessed with the kids, keeping them close even after they were gone. Folks around here call him the caretaker's shadow now. They say he's still out there. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and drive as far as I could, but something, whether it was my curiosity or that boy's haunting eyes, drew me back to the playground that evening. As dusk fell, I stood by the swings, my camera in hand. The boy appeared again, this time at the edge of the clearing. "You found them, didn't you?" he asked. "Found who?" I demanded. "What are you talking about?" "My friends," he said, stepping closer. His face seemed paler now, his features sharper, almost gaunt. "They're waiting for me, but the caretaker won't let them go." Before I could respond, the air grew colder. The boy turned his head sharply, his eyes fixed on something behind me. I spun around, my flashlight revealing nothing but shadows. Yet I felt it. A presence, heavy and oppressive, bearing down on me. "Run," the boy whispered. I bolted toward the cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, the laughter had turned to shrieks, high-pitched and inhuman. I slammed the cabin door shut and fumbled with my flashlight, its beam flickering weakly. The air inside felt suffocating, and the shadows seemed to ripple and shift. My gaze fell on the drawings again, and I noticed something I hadn't before. A lantern sketched into one corner, its flame surrounded by jagged lines. Desperate, I searched the cabin and found it. An old lantern, rusted but intact. Beside it lay a whistle, tarnished with age. I grabbed both, feeling a strange sense of purpose. Outside, the playground was alive with movement. The swings and merry-go-round spun wildly, though there was no wind. The boy stood in the center, his figure wavering like a mirage. And looming behind him was a shadow, the caretaker. He was massive, his form indistinct but menacing. His eyes glowed faintly, locking onto me as I stepped into the clearing. The boy turned, his face pleading, "Help us!" I lifted the whistle and blew with all my might. A sharp, piercing sound cut through the air and the shadows recoiled. The caretaker let out a guttural roar, his form flickering like a dying flame. I lit the lantern, its weak light growing brighter and brighter until it bathed the playground in a warm glow. The boy smiled, his face softening. One by one, other children appeared, their shadowy forms dissolving into faint, golden light. They gathered around the boy, and together they turned toward the forest, fading into the trees. The caretaker let out one final anguished cry before collapsing into the earth. The playground fell silent, its rusted equipment still at last. I returned to my RV, my hands shaking. The next morning, I left Salt Fork without looking back. That night, as I reviewed my photos, I found one last image I didn't remember taking. It was of the playground, bathed in the lantern's light, with the boy and his friends standing together, their faces serene. And at the edge of the frame, barely visible, was the shadow of a man, watching. Writing is supposed to be therapeutic, that's what they all say. Pour your soul into your work, my therapist advised, as if putting my existential dread into words would magically fix my life. I believed her, at least for a while, but months had passed, and the words never came. So here I was, parked in the middle of nowhere in Tar Hollow State Forest, my RV nestled under a canopy of towering oaks. I'd heard about this place in passing, a quiet retreat for hikers and campers. But it was the stories about the Devil's Bridge that intrigued me. Folklore, tragedy, and a cursed crossing. It had the makings of something special. Maybe even the inspiration I needed to finish my novel. The bridge wasn't far from my campsite, about a 15-minute walk through a narrow trail. On my first evening, I made the trek, camera in hand, eager to find this supposed hotspot for ghost stories. The path twisted through the forest, the late afternoon light filtering through the leaves. It felt serene at first, almost too quiet. Then I saw it. A crumbling stone bridge spanning a sluggish creek. The air around it felt heavier somehow, the silence deafening. As I approached, I noticed the water beneath the bridge reflected the trees above, but something was off. The reflection shimmered strangely, warping like heat waves on asphalt. I snapped a few pictures and recorded some video, narrating for my own benefit. "The infamous Devil's Bridge," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the stillness. "Said to be cursed, haunted by a grieving woman who—" A splash cut me off. The water rippled, though nothing had fallen in. I peered closer, but the creek was as empty as it had been a moment ago. Just the wind, I told myself, though my pulse quickened. I was probably letting the stories get to me. Still, as I walked back to the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was rain, but it wasn't coming from the roof. It was faint and rhythmic, dripping water. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The noise seemed to come from outside near the creek. Curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped into the cool night air. The forest was cloaked in darkness. the trees barely outlined against the faint glow of the crescent moon. The dripping sound was louder now, drawing me toward the bridge. When I arrived, I saw her. She stood in the middle of the bridge, her back to me. She was dressed in white, the fabric fluttering faintly even though there was no breeze. Her shoulders were hunched, her head bowed, and a soft sobbing reached my ears. I froze, every rational part of me screaming to turn back. But something about her, about the way she cried, pulled me forward. "Ma'am?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Are you okay?" Her sobbing stopped. She turned slowly, her movements fluid but unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her face was pale, her eyes dark hollows that seemed to drink in the light. She opened her mouth, but the sound that came out wasn't a cry. It was a whisper, carried on the wind. "Help me!" I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The reflection in the creek caught my eye. Her figure was there, but so was something else. A shadow loomed behind me in the water's surface, tall and formless, its shape flickering like smoke. I ran. The next morning, I drove into town, desperate for answers. At a small diner, I struck up a conversation with the locals, asking about the bridge. Most of them avoided eye contact, muttering about it being bad luck. But one man, a retired sheriff named Andrews, finally spoke up. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, his tone grim. I nodded. "Who is she?" "Legend says she was a mother who lost her child in that creek. Drowned, they say. She followed not long after. But she's no grieving mother now." He leaned closer. "The stories say she made a deal with something dark. Now she's cursed to guard that bridge, trapping anyone who gets too close." I laughed nervously, though my gut told me he wasn't joking. And the shadow, I saw something else. Andrew shook his head. "No one knows what that is. Some say it's the devil himself. Others think it's the souls she's taken. Best advice I can give you is to pack up and leave. That bridge doesn't let people go easily." I should have listened. Instead, I returned to the bridge that afternoon. I couldn't help myself. Something about it drew me in, as if it held the key to my creative block. Or maybe something deeper, something darker. This time, I noticed symbols carved into the stones near the bridge, intricate spirals and jagged lines that seemed to pulse if I stared too long. The air grew colder, and the water's reflection twisted again, showing not just the trees, but faint images of faces. They flickered like static on an old TV, their mouths moving soundlessly. The shadow was there too, in the water. It moved unnaturally, stretching toward me. I backed away and nearly tripped over a small overgrown path. It led deeper into the forest, the underbrush thick and uninviting. I don't know why I followed it. Curiosity, maybe, or the faint hope of finding answers. The path ended at a dilapidated shack, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and time. Inside, the air was stifling, heavy with the scent of damp earth. The walls were covered in writing, scratched into the wood in frantic, uneven lines. Words like cursed and marked jumped out at me, along with the name Watcher. On a small rotting table sat a mirror. I stepped closer, drawn to the glass, but when I looked into it, my reflection wasn't my own. My eyes glowed red, and my face was twisted in agony. Behind me, the shadow loomed closer than ever. I fled back to the RV, but the unease stayed with me. That night, the sobbing returned, louder this time, echoing through the trees. The woman appeared outside my window, her hollow eyes fixed on me. She mouthed the words, "Help me." But I knew better now. I stayed inside, gripping a knife I'd brought from the kitchen. The RV shook slightly, as if something was pushing against it, testing its strength. The mark on my arm burned, a symbol I hadn't noticed before, etched into my skin like the carvings on the bridge. By dawn, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed up and started the engine, but the RV wouldn't move. The wheels spun uselessly, as if the forest itself was holding me in place. Desperation clawed at me, and I found myself back at the bridge, drawn by some invisible force. The woman stood waiting, her form shifting like a mirage. "You have to help me," she said, her voice both pleading and commanding. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. She stepped closer, her face twisting into something monstrous. "Your soul," she whispered. The shadow surged from the creek, wrapping around me like smoke. My vision blurred, and for a moment I was underwater, the weight of the darkness pulling me down. Just when I thought I would drown, a new presence emerged, the Watcher. It stood between me and the woman, its form still shadowy but somehow less menacing. It raised a hand and the woman shrieked, her figure dissolving into the air. The shadow around me loosened its grip, and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. When I opened my eyes, the bridge was gone, collapsed into the creek as if it had never existed. I left Tar Hollow that day, abandoning my RV and most of my belongings. Even now, far from the forest, I feel the mark on my arm, a burning reminder of what I faced. The mirror in my hotel room reflects something different now. My eyes are darker, my face gaunt, and at night I still hear her voice. "Help me." I've always loved uncovering forgotten stories. It's why I became an urban explorer, digging into history and capturing it for my YouTube channel. The old ruins, ghost towns, and abandoned buildings have always felt alive to me, whispering secrets of those who came before. That's what brought me to Shawnee State Forest, deep in the heart of Ohio. Locals called it the Little Smokies, and I'd heard rumors of old settler cabins and stone ruins hidden in its dense woods. Some said the forest was cursed, haunted by the spirit of a witch known as the Crone. Perfect for my channel. Spooky stories pulled in views, and honestly, I didn't believe any of it. I rolled my RV into a secluded campsite just past a trailhead, the dense trees swallowing me in their shadows. The air felt different here, heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. But I brushed it off. I was here to explore, document, and, let's be real, give my audience a little scare. The first day was promising. I hiked through the trails, my camera capturing the endless expanse of trees and the occasional wildlife that darted through the underbrush. After a couple of miles, I found my prize. A crumbling stone foundation, hidden beneath a tangle of vines. It looked ancient. Moss covered the stones, and the air smelled damp and earthy. As I stepped closer, I noticed strange carvings etched into the rock. At first, I thought they were just random scratches from weather or animals. But as I traced my fingers over the grooves, a pattern emerged. Symbols. They were crude but deliberate, forming a jagged star surrounded by looping lines. It looked like something out of a horror movie. I filmed everything, narrating as I went. "This must have been a settler's cabin," I said, zooming in on the carvings. "But these symbols, they don't look like anything I've seen before. Maybe witchcraft? What do you think, guys?" By the time I got back to the RV, the sun was setting, and the forest had grown eerily quiet. Even the crickets seemed to hold back their usual nighttime chorus. That night, I dreamt of her. She was gaunt, her face pale and drawn, with eyes like dying embers. A tattered hood covered her head, and her bony fingers reached out for me. "One step closer," she whispered, her voice dry and brittle like leaves. "One step closer." I jolted awake, drenched in sweat. The RV was silent, save for my ragged breathing. I told myself it was just a dream, a product of my overactive imagination. But as I rubbed my arm, I felt a sharp sting. When I looked down, there it was. A faint but unmistakable scratch, forming one of the symbols I'd seen on the ruins. The next morning, I packed up my camera and headed deeper into the forest. The air felt thicker as I walked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to focus on the beauty around me, the sunlight filtering through the trees, the crisp smell of pine, but the unease clung to me. That's when I found him. His cabin was hidden among the trees, a ramshackle structure that looked like it might collapse at any moment. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the faint smell of wood smoke and something sharper, maybe herbs, drifted through the air. I almost turned back, but curiosity got the better of me. The man who emerged was grizzled and wiry, his face weathered like old leather. He looked at me with sharp, calculating eyes that made me feel like I was the one out of place. "You're not from around here," he said, his voice rough. "No, just passing through," I replied, trying to sound casual. "I'm an urban explorer. I film old sites, ruins, stuff like that." He snorted, shaking his head. "You shouldn't be poking around in these woods. You've been to the ruins, haven't you?" I hesitated. "Yeah, why?" He gave me a hard look, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You found the mark, didn't you?" The scratch on my arm burned as if on cue. I pulled up my sleeve, showing him. "How did you?" "She's got her claws in you now," he said, his voice grim. "The Crone. She marks those who wander too close. You're just the latest fool to stumble into her trap." I wanted to laugh it off, but his tone made it impossible. "So what happens now?" I asked, half joking. "She curses me? Steals my soul?" Ezra, as he introduced himself, didn't laugh. "You'll see things, hear things. She'll draw you deeper, closer to where she waits. And when you're ready, she'll take you." "Take me where?" "To the dark." The whispers started that night. At first, they were faint, like a distant breeze. But as the hours ticked by, they grew louder, weaving through the stillness of the forest. They called my name, soft and insistent. "Jake," one step closer. I huddled in my RV, every nerve on edge. My camera sat on the table, and I grabbed it like a talisman, pointing it toward the windows. The light outside was weak, but I could have sworn I saw movement. Shadows flitting between the trees. The mark on my arm throbbed, darker now, the lines more intricate. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I went back to the ruins. I needed answers. The forest felt different this time, more alive, but not in a comforting way. It was as if the trees were leaning closer, their branches stretching toward me. When I reached the ruins, the air grew cold. My breath fogged in front of me, despite the warm spring day. And then I saw her. She was standing in the center of the stone foundation, her hooded figure barely solid, like smoke caught in a draft. Her head tilted, and I felt her eyes, those ember-like eyes, boring into me. "Why me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You sought me out," she whispered. "You found my mark one step closer." The shadows around her shifted, forming twisted, half-seen shapes, faces, hands, bodies that seemed to writhe and reach. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my camera. "You can't have me," I shouted. Her lips twisted into something like a smile. "You belong to me now." I don't remember running back to the RV. My legs moved on autopilot, terror propelling me forward. By the time I locked the door behind me, my chest was heaving, my mind racing. The mark on my arm burned hotter than ever, spreading like ink across my skin. My reflection in the RV's mirror looked wrong. My eyes were darker, my face hollow. I barely recognized myself. That night, the whispers didn't just call my name. They laughed, low and guttural, filling the small space with their weight. The shadows outside pressed closer, their shapes contorting into impossible forms. I realized then that I couldn't stay. If I did, she would come for me, just as Ezra had said. I left Shawnee State Forest the next morning, but the mark didn't fade. It grew darker, more intricate, and the whispers followed me. Even now, as I sit miles away in the hotel room, I can hear her voice. "One step closer," she says, her words curling in my ears like smoke. I don't know how far I'll have to run, but I know one thing for sure. She's not done with me. I should have known better. 50 years as a park ranger taught me one thing. When locals warn you about a place, you listen. But I've never been one to believe in ghost stories. Superstitions were just another thing that came with small-town life, like potluck dinners and neighbors who knew your business. After my wife passed, I sold the house. It felt too empty, too loud with her absence. I hit the road in our old RV, looking for places where the silence wasn't so heavy. That's how I ended up at Dead Man's Hollow in southeastern Ohio, a place with a reputation darker than the coal it used to mine. The name alone should have given me pause. The gas station was the last bit of civilization before the road turned to dirt and the woods swallowed the world. The young guy at the counter was a jittery type, all elbows and sideways glances. "You heading up to the hollow?" he asked as he handed me my change. "Yeah," I replied, tossing the bag of jerky onto the passenger seat. His eyes darted to the parking lot. "You shouldn't go there." "Oh yeah? Why's that?" "People go missing out there, or come back different." He leaned in closer. "My granddad said the land's cursed. Miners died bad back in the day, and folks started seeing things." I gave him a polite nod and left. I didn't need a campfire story, I needed peace. The road into Dead Man's Hollow twisted like a snake, the trees crowding so close they nearly blocked out the sun. By the time I reached the old campsite, shadows stretched long across the clearing. It was just me and my RV, alone in the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Perfect. I set up camp and brewed a pot of coffee, the rich smell cutting through the cool evening air. The first night passed quietly, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The second night was when the tapping started. It woke me around midnight. A faint, rhythmic sound on the RV window. Tap, tap, tap. I rolled over, groggy and annoyed. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the glass, but when I pulled back the curtain, nothing was there. Just darkness and the skeletal outlines of trees. The tapping stopped as soon as I looked. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. A narrow trail led from the campsite into the heart of the hollow, winding through dense underbrush. It wasn't long before I came across the ruins of the old mining operation. A rusted winch, crumbling stone walls, and the gaping black maw of a collapsed mine entrance. That's when I saw it. A mining helmet half buried in the dirt. Its lamp was shattered, and the leather strap had rotted away, but something about it called to me. I brushed off the dirt and slipped it into my pack. As I turned to leave, I felt it. A prickling sensation, like static electricity crawling over my skin. The air grew heavy, the kind of pressure that signals an oncoming storm. I glanced back at the mine, half expecting to see someone watching me. Nothing. By the time I returned to camp, the feeling had passed, but unease lingered like the smell of smoke after a fire. That night, the tapping came back. Louder this time. I sat up, every nerve on edge. The sound was steady, deliberate, not the random scratching of a branch or the scampering of an animal. Tap, tap, tap. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty woods. The night was unnaturally still. No wind, no crickets, not even the hoot of an owl. Then I saw them. Footprints. They circled the RV, leading toward the ruins. My stomach tightened as I crouched to examine them. They were boot prints, wide and deep, as if made by someone dragging heavy equipment. But they weren't fresh. The edges were crumbling, as though the soil had been disturbed long ago. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I told myself I was imagining things. Grief can play tricks on the mind, and I was no stranger to the loneliness that comes with isolation. But when I saw the mining helmet sitting on the table, perfectly cleaned and polished, I knew something was wrong. I hadn't touched it since I found it. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Static hissed from the speakers, rising and falling like waves. Then, faintly, I heard it. Voices. "Mister, help, us." The words were garbled, buried beneath the static but unmistakable. My breath caught as the static turned to a low, guttural moan. The radio clicked off on its own, leaving me in deafening silence. I should have left right then, packed up, hit the road, and never looked back. But something in me, a mix of pride and curiosity, drove me back to the ruins that night. The hollow was darker than before, the trees pressing in like watchful sentinels. I reached the mine entrance, my flashlight barely piercing the blackness. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the void. The air shifted, carrying with it a metallic tang. A faint light flickered deep within the collapsed mine, a lantern. It bobbed slowly, as if carried by an unseen hand. I stepped closer, and the ground seemed to hum beneath my feet. The light grew brighter, and then they appeared. Shadowy figures, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness around them. They moved silently, their lanterns casting an unnatural, cold light. One turned toward me, its hollow gaze locking with mine. My legs froze, rooted to the spot as the shadows closed in. Then she appeared. The woman in black. Her form was sharper than the others, her face pale and expressionless beneath the hood of her tattered cloak. She raised a hand and the shadows stopped. Her eyes bored into me, unblinking and full of malice. "You disturbed their rest," she whispered. Her voice was like the rustle of dead leaves, brittle and ancient. Before I could respond, the ground beneath me gave way. I woke hours later, sprawled in the clearing near my RV. My flashlight was gone, and my clothes were smeared with dirt. The mining helmet sat beside me, shattered into pieces. Scrawled in ash on the ground was a single word: leave. The ghosts were gone, but their warning was clear. I didn't waste time packing. As I drove out of the hollow, the shadows seemed to follow, their lanterns flickering in the rearview mirror until I reached the main road. Back in town, I stopped at a diner for coffee, my hands still shaking. The waitress gave me a sympathetic smile. "You okay, hun?" she asked. "Dead Man's Hollow," I said, my voice hoarse. Her face fell. "You shouldn't have gone there." "Yeah," I muttered. "I figured that out." Weeks later, as I prepared for another trip, I found the mining helmet on my passenger seat. It was whole again, its lamp gleaming like new. No matter how far I drive, I don't think I'll ever really leave Dead Man's Hollow.